Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little uncomfortable, a little strange, and somehow very, very common throughout history. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe lie back and let your brain slowly drift as we wander through a world where one simple word could change a woman's entire life. That word is no. Now today, saying no to a marriage proposal might lead to some awkward conversations, maybe a few hurt feelings, possibly a dramatic WhatsApp status update. But in the past, saying no could lead to something far more permanent. Something legal, something humiliating, and sometimes something quietly devastating. So let's ease into this gently. Imagine you are a young woman in a medieval town. Nothing fancy. Just stone walls, uneven streets, and a general smell that no one talks about, but everyone notices. You are not particularly powerful. You are not particularly free either. Your life is mostly arranged for you. And then one day, someone decides you should get married. Not you, of course. That would be far too modern. No, your father decides, or your uncle, or some distant relative who suddenly becomes very interested in your future. And by future, they mostly mean land, alliances, or settling a debt that has been awkwardly lingering for years. Now, here's the interesting part. What happens if you say no? At first you might think, well, nothing. People argue, people disagree. Surely you can just refuse. But history has a way of leaning in very slowly and saying, not really. Let's start with something that sounds almost reasonable at first. Social pressure. In many parts of medieval Europe, refusing a marriage was seen less as a personal choice and more as a problem, a disruption, a kind of mild scandal. You were expected to marry. It was not just about you. It was about your family's reputation, their alliances, their financial stability. So when a woman refused, the reaction was not immediate punishment. Not at first. Instead, it was quieter. People would talk. Of course they would. Neighbors would whisper. Relatives would sigh dramatically. Someone would say, "She is being difficult," in that very specific tone that suggests you have personally offended the entire social structure. And slowly, the pressure would build. You might be told that you are selfish, that you are ungrateful, that you are risking your family's future, that your younger siblings might suffer because of your stubbornness. Because, naturally, everything eventually becomes your fault. And if that did not work, well, there were other methods. One of the more common responses was confinement. Not in a dramatic dungeon with chains way. That comes later. This was softer, more polite, more controlled. A woman who refused marriage might suddenly find her world becoming very small. She might not be allowed to leave the house alone. Her movements might be restricted. Visitors might be carefully monitored. Letters might mysteriously stop reaching her. It was not officially called a punishment. That would sound harsh. It was simply supervision. Because clearly she was not making the right decisions. And if she continued to resist, things could escalate in a very specific direction that history seems to favor again and again. The convent. Now at first glance, a convent does not sound so bad. Peaceful, quiet, a life of prayer and reflection. Possibly even a break from the chaos of family politics. But in many cases, for women who refused marriage, the convent was not a calling. It was a solution. A very convenient solution. You do not want to marry? That is fine. You will simply marry God instead. No further discussion required. And just like that, a life decision is made. Some women adapted to this. Some even found genuine peace there. But for others, it was a kind of quiet exile. A life chosen for them because they had dared to choose something else. And then, of course, there are the more direct consequences. In certain regions and time periods, refusing marriage could lead to legal action. Yes, actual legal consequences. Because marriage was not just a personal arrangement, it was a contract. And breaking or refusing that contract could be treated as a kind of offense. Fathers could bring complaints. Suitors could claim damages. Courts could get involved in what we would now consider a deeply personal decision, and the outcomes were not always kind. A woman might lose her dowry, which in practical terms meant losing her financial security. She might be declared disobedient, which sounds mild but carried serious social consequences. It could affect her ability to marry in the future, her standing in the community, even her basic safety. Because once you are labeled as difficult, people tend to treat you differently. And then there were the more creative punishments. Public humiliation was always a popular option in history. It required minimal effort and maximum impact. A woman who refused marriage might be subjected to public shaming. Not always officially. Sometimes it was just encouraged. She might be mocked, singled out, turned into a cautionary tale for others. Look at her, people would say. This is what happens when you do not behave properly. And that phrase, properly, does a lot of heavy lifting here, because what it really means is, according to expectations. Now, let's gently drift to another place. Not all punishments were immediate or obvious. Some were slower, more subtle, and in many ways, more effective. Economic pressure. For example, if a woman refused marriage, her family might simply stop supporting her. Not in a dramatic announcement, just gradually, quietly. Fewer resources, less protection, fewer opportunities, and in a world where survival often depended on family networks, this was not a small thing. It was a way of making independence feel impossible, because if you cannot survive alone, then saying no becomes much harder. And this brings us to a slightly uncomfortable realization. Many women did not say yes because they wanted to. They said yes because every alternative had been carefully removed. Now let's not rush. Let's take this slowly, because history is not always about dramatic events. Sometimes it is about systems, about patterns, about the quiet ways people are guided, pushed, or gently forced into certain paths. And refusing marriage, well, that was one of those moments where the system revealed itself very clearly. You could say, no. Technically. But the cost of that no could be everything. Let's float over to another kind of story. Royal women. Now you might think that queens and princesses had more freedom. After all, they had power, wealth, influence. Surely they could choose their own lives. That would be a very comforting thought. It would also be mostly incorrect. For royal women, marriage was even less about personal choice. It was diplomacy, strategy, a way to secure alliances, end conflicts, or occasionally start new ones. So when a royal woman refused marriage, it was not just a personal decision. It was a political problem. And political problems tend to be handled firmly. Some were pressured. Some were threatened. Some were simply ignored until they agreed. And in a few cases, refusal led to something that sounds almost poetic, but was actually quite bleak. They were declared unfit. Unfit to rule. Unfit to inherit. Unfit to participate in the very systems they were born into. Which is a very efficient way of removing someone from power without having to make a big scene. Because once you are labeled as unfit, your choices no longer matter. And then, of course, there were the families. Families, throughout history, have had a remarkable ability to turn personal decisions into collective crises. A daughter refusing marriage was not just a daughter refusing marriage. It was a family losing an alliance, losing status, losing potential wealth. And so the response was often intense, emotional pressure, guilt, manipulation, sometimes even threats. Because again, it was not about the individual. It was about the system. And the system did not like disruptions. Now as we slowly settle into this pattern, something becomes very clear. Punishments for refusing marriage were not always about punishment, in the obvious sense. They were about control, about guiding behavior, about maintaining order, about ensuring that people did what they were expected to do. And when someone stepped outside that expectation, the response was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was subtle, and sometimes it was simply unavoidable. So as you lie there, listening to this, drifting a little deeper into that soft, slow space between waking and sleep. Just keep that in mind. In the past, saying no was not just a word. It was a decision with consequences that could ripple through an entire life. And we are only just getting started. Because as we move forward, things will become a little more specific, a little more personal, and occasionally, a little more strange. But for now, just stay comfortable and let the story continue to unfold. So, we've eased into the idea that saying no to marriage was rarely just a personal decision. It was more like stepping into a slow-moving storm that had already been forming long before you arrived. Let's continue drifting through this time, a little closer to home, a little more personal. Because if there is one group in history that took a woman's refusal to marry very seriously, it was her own family. And not always in a warm, supportive, we respect your choices kind of way. More in a, we need to fix this immediately before the neighbors notice kind of way. Families, especially in older societies, were not just emotional units. They were economic systems, political units, social networks. Every member had a role. And daughters, whether anyone said it out loud or not, were often seen as strategic assets. That sounds a bit cold. Because it was. A marriage could strengthen alliances, bring in wealth, secure land, or simply improve the family standing. So when a daughter refused, it was not just inconvenient, it was disruptive. And disruption tends to make people creative. Let's start with something that appears gentle on the surface. Persuasion. The light, casual kind. Not hey, have you thought about it? More like a sustained, carefully coordinated campaign of emotional pressure. Parents would remind her of her duties, her responsibilities, her place in the family. There would be long conversations that felt less like discussions and more like slow, polite interrogations. You will be happy, they might say. He is a good match, they would insist. This is what is best for everyone. And that last part, for everyone, usually carried the most weight. Because refusing meant you were not just choosing for yourself. You were, in their eyes, choosing against everyone else. And if persuasion did not work, families often moved to something slightly more structured. Restriction. Now, we touched on this before, but within the family, it became more intense, more deliberate. A woman who refused marriage might find her independence shrinking almost overnight. Outings would be limited. Social interactions controlled. She might not be allowed to meet certain people, especially anyone who might inconveniently support her decision. Her world would narrow, not violently, not dramatically. Just steadily, because the idea was simple. If you remove alternatives, the original option starts to look a lot more appealing. And then there was something even more effective. Silence. Families could withdraw emotionally. Conversations would become shorter. Warmer interactions would cool. That easy sense of belonging would fade. It is a strange kind of pressure, being surrounded by people who suddenly feel distant, not hostile exactly, just disappointed. And disappointment, especially from family, has a way of settling in very deeply. Now, let's drift into something slightly more direct. Financial control. In many societies, women did not have independent access to wealth. Their financial security was tied to their families, and later, to their husbands. So refusing marriage could trigger a very practical consequence. Support might be reduced, or quietly withdrawn. Clothing, food, personal allowances. All the small things that make daily life comfortable could become uncertain. And again, there would be no dramatic announcement. No formal punishment. Just a gradual shift that made independence feel less like a choice and more like an impossible dream. Because survival, as always, was the quiet foundation of every decision. Now, in some cases, families took things even further. Arranged marriages could proceed, whether the woman agreed or not. Yes, really. Consent, as we understand it today, was not always considered essential. If the family decided the marriage was necessary, arrangements could be finalized, contracts signed, ceremonies prepared, and the woman at the center of it all. might simply be expected to comply, and if she did not, well, resistance could lead to consequences that were harder to ignore. Physical confinement was not unheard of. Being locked in a room, guarded, prevented from leaving until the situation was resolved. It sounds dramatic. And sometimes it was, but more often, it was presented as protection. We are keeping you safe. We are preventing you from making a mistake, which is an interesting way of describing imprisonment. Now let's slow down for a moment, because not every story followed the same path. Some families were less strict. Some women had more room to negotiate. Some managed to delay, redirect, or quietly avoid unwanted marriages. But those cases were exceptions. The general pattern remained. Family expectations were powerful, and refusing them came at a cost. Let's gently shift our focus again. This time to the idea of reputation. Because in many societies, a woman's value was closely tied to how she was perceived. Her reputation was not just personal. It was a reflection of her entire family. So when she refused marriage, it raised questions. Why is she refusing? Is there something wrong with her? Is she difficult, disobedient, unstable? And once those questions started circulating, they had a way of growing. Reputation in the past was fragile. It could be shaped by whispers, assumptions, and the occasional dramatic retelling of events that may or may not have happened. A woman who refused marriage could quickly become a story, and not always a flattering one. This had long-term consequences. Future proposals might disappear. Social invitations might become less frequent. Opportunities could quietly close, because people tend to avoid uncertainty. And a woman who had already refused one marriage was seen as unpredictable. And unpredictability made others nervous. Now, here is where things become a little more subtle. Internal pressure. Because after enough time, enough conversations, enough restrictions, something begins to shift. The resistance itself becomes exhausting. Saying no repeatedly in the face of constant pressure is not easy. It requires energy, confidence, a sense of self that can withstand being questioned again and again. And not everyone had the resources to maintain that. So sometimes, the outcome was not forced compliance. It was gradual acceptance. Not because the woman changed her mind in a sudden, dramatic moment, but because the alternative paths had been slowly worn away, and agreeing became the easiest way forward, which, in its own quiet way, is a kind of resolution. Now, let's float over to something slightly different. Communities. Because families did not exist in isolation. They were part of larger networks, villages, towns, courts, and these communities often played a role in reinforcing expectations. A woman refusing marriage could become a communal issue. Neighbors might intervene, elders might offer advice, religious figures might step in to guide or gently pressure her toward the right decision. And the collective voice of a community is difficult to ignore, because it is not just one person telling you what to do. It is everyone. And when everyone seems to agree, even the strongest objections can start to feel misplaced. Now, as we continue drifting through this, something becomes clear again. Punishments were not always about dramatic acts. They were about systems of influence, layers of pressure that work together to guide behavior in very specific directions. Family, community, economy, reputation, all moving in the same way, all gently but firmly, steering toward marriage and away from refusal. So when a woman said no, she was not just resisting one person, she was resisting an entire structure, which is a much heavier thing to carry. Now, as you settle a little deeper, maybe feeling that slow, steady rhythm of the story, just let this thought linger. In many cases, the punishment for refusing marriage was not a single event. It was a process, a slow unfolding of consequences that touched every part of life. And often, by the time it was over, the original choice no longer felt like a choice at all. We will keep moving, because there are still more layers to uncover. Some quieter, some stranger, and some that will feel almost oddly familiar. But for now, just stay with the flow. and let the past continue to speak in its own complicated way. So, we've seen families apply pressure, communities lean in, and life slowly narrow around a single decision. Now let's drift into another layer. A softer voice, perhaps, but one that carried an enormous weight. Religion. Not in a dramatic, thunder and lightning kind of way. No booming voices from the sky. Just steady expectations, gentle guidance, and a very clear idea of how life was supposed to unfold. In many societies, marriage was not just practical, it was moral, it was spiritual. It was presented as part of a natural order that you were not really meant to question. So when a woman refused marriage, it was not simply a social inconvenience. It became a concern. Let's move through this slowly. Religious figures often played the role of advisors. Calm, composed, and very certain. They would speak in measured tones about duty, purpose, and the importance of following a path that had been laid out long before anyone currently alive had a say in it. You were meant for this, they might suggest. There is a plan, they would add, in that reassuring way that somehow makes disagreement feel slightly inappropriate. And again, it sounds gentle, because it usually was, but gentle does not mean optional. A refusal could be interpreted as more than just a personal preference. It could be seen as a rejection of divine intention, a turning away from what was considered right, proper, and expected. And that carried a different kind of pressure, not just from people, but from belief itself. Now, in some cases, religious communities offered an alternative. If you did not want to marry, you could dedicate your life to faith, become a nun, join a convent, live a life of devotion. And on paper, this sounds like a choice, but as we touched on earlier, it was not always a free one. For some women, this path was chosen for them, especially if their refusal to marry created tension that the family or community wanted to resolve quickly and quietly. A convent became a kind of compromise. You are not disrupting the marriage system anymore. You are not creating uncertainty. You are simply stepping out of the equation entirely. Problem solved. And again, it was not presented as punishment. It was presented as purpose, which is a very elegant way of framing things. Now, let's slow down and look a little closer. Life in a convent was not necessarily harsh. Many women found stability there, education, even a structured environment that offered a different kind of existence. But for others, especially those placed there against their will, it could feel like a life paused, or perhaps redirected without consent. The world outside continued. Marriages were made. Families grew. And they remained within stone walls, following routines that had been decided for them. Quietly. Without much room for reconsideration. Now, let's move slightly beyond Europe for a moment, because these patterns were not limited to one region. Different cultures, different religions, but often similar expectations. In many traditional societies, marriage was deeply tied to religious duty. Refusing it could be seen as a failure to fulfill one's role, a disruption not just of social order, but of spiritual balance. And again, the response was not always loud. It was steady. Conversations with elders, guidance from religious leaders, gentle reminders that life had a structure, and that stepping outside of it could have consequences, not always immediate, not always visible, but real. And here is where things become a little more internal, because belief has a way of settling into a person's mind. If you are told, again and again, that a certain path is right, that it is part of something larger than yourself, then choosing a different path can feel not just difficult, but wrong. Even if, somewhere deep down, it feels right. So a woman refusing marriage might not only face external pressure, she might also face doubt. Am I making a mistake? Am I going against something important? Am I supposed to be doing this? And those questions can be heavy, because they do not come from outside voices anymore. They come from within. Now, let's gently shift again, because religion did not always punish directly. It rarely needed to. Instead, It shaped the framework in which punishment made sense. It defined what was normal, what was acceptable, what was expected. And once those definitions were in place, society, family, and community could operate within them very easily, which is why the consequences of refusal often felt inevitable, not because someone was enforcing them loudly, but because everything around the individual pointed in the same direction. Now, of course, there were exceptions. There were women who resisted, who carved out different paths, who found ways to live outside the expected structure. But those stories, while fascinating, were often rare, and sometimes difficult. Because going against a system that is supported by family, community, and belief is not a small thing. It requires a kind of strength that history does not always record in detail. But it was there. Quietly. Now, let's take a softer turn for a moment, because not all religious influence was restrictive. In some cases, it provided a form of protection. A woman who chose a religious life voluntarily could avoid unwanted marriage without facing the same level of criticism. It gave her a socially acceptable reason to step away. I am devoted, she could say. And that was understood, respected, even. So in that sense, religion offered both pressure and escape, constraint and refuge, which is a bit complicated, but history often is. Now, as we continue to drift through this, one thing becomes clearer. The punishment for refusing marriage was rarely a single event. It was a network of influences. Family expectations, social norms, religious beliefs, all quietly reinforcing each other, all guiding behavior in a very specific direction. And when someone stepped outside of that direction, the response was not always dramatic, but it was persistent. Now, as you settle deeper, maybe feeling that slow rhythm again, just let this idea rest gently. In the past, freedom was often defined not by what you could do, but by what you could refuse. And for many women, refusal came with a cost that was not always obvious at first. But revealed itself slowly. Over time, we'll keep moving forward, because there are still more layers to uncover, some a little darker, some a little stranger, and some that will make you pause and think quietly. But for now, just stay relaxed. And let the story continue, one calm step at a time. So, we've wandered through families, communities, and belief systems, all gently, steadily shaping what a woman's life was supposed to look like. Now we arrive at something softer, less visible, but in many ways more lasting. What happened after the refusal? Because even when the arguments ended, even when the pressure settled, even when no obvious punishment followed, something often remained, a kind of quiet consequence. Let's ease into this slowly. Imagine a woman who has refused marriage and somehow managed to hold her ground. No forced wedding, no immediate confinement, no sudden relocation to a convent. On the surface, it might seem like she has succeeded. But life around her has changed, not dramatically, not all at once. Just slightly. And then a little more. Social circles might shrink. Invitations become less frequent. Conversations grow shorter. There is a certain hesitation in how people interact with her. Not hostility, just distance, because she has stepped outside of expectation. And once that happens, people are not always sure how to respond. So they keep things polite and slightly removed. Now, let's move a little closer. Reputation, once shaped, has a way of lingering. A woman who refused marriage might carry a label, even if no one says it directly. Independent, difficult. Unusual. And while some of those words might sound neutral, or even positive today, in the past, they were often used with a quiet edge, a suggestion that something was off. And that subtle shift in perception could influence everything. Friendships, opportunities, even simple daily interactions, because people tend to treat you not just as you are, but as they believe you to be. Now let's drift into something even quieter. Loneliness. Not the dramatic, tragic kind, but the slow, subtle kind. Because in many societies, marriage was not just expected. It was central to social life. It shaped where you lived, who you spent time with, how your days were structured. And stepping away from that path could mean stepping away from a shared experience that connected most people around you. Conversations about family, children, household life. All of it might feel slightly distant, like listening to a story you are not part of, and over time, that distance can grow. Now, of course, not every story ends in isolation. Some women built alternative lives. They formed friendships, found purpose in work, contributed to their communities in different ways, but those paths were not always easy to find. And they were not always supported, because the system, as we have seen, was not designed for them. Now, let's take a slightly different angle. Economic independence. For many women, refusing marriage meant losing access to the resources that came with it. A household, financial support, a defined place in the social structure. And without those things, life required creativity. Some found work. Some relied on extended family. Some navigated a careful balance of independence and dependence that shifted over time. But it was rarely simple, because the options available were limited. And the safety nets were not always reliable. Now, let's pause for a moment. Because here is where things become quietly ironic. In many cases, the punishment for refusing marriage was not a single action. It was the absence of something. The absence of support. The absence of belonging. The absence of a clear path forward. And sometimes, absence can be more difficult to navigate than direct opposition, because there is nothing to push against. Just space. Now, let's gently return to the bigger picture. Across different times and places, the details varied. The customs changed. The language shifted, but the pattern remained surprisingly consistent. Marriage was expected. Refusal was discouraged. And the consequences, whether loud or quiet, were designed to guide people back toward that expectation. Not always through force, often through influence. Through pressure. Through the slow shaping of possibilities until only one path felt realistic. Now, as we begin to settle toward the end of this long, calm journey, there is one more thought to rest on. Not every woman who refused marriage saw herself as resisting a system. Some simply felt uncertain. Or uninterested, or unwilling to step into a life that did not feel like their own. And yet that simple feeling, that quiet hesitation, could ripple outward in ways that affected everything, because the world around them was structured in a way that did not easily accommodate that hesitation. And so, the response was not always dramatic. It was not always immediate, but it was persistent. Now, as you lie there, maybe a little more relaxed, maybe drifting just at the edge of sleep, let this idea settle in gently. In the past, choices were rarely just choices. They were intersections, points where personal desire met social expectation, family interest, and cultural belief. And when those things did not align, something had to give. Sometimes it was the individual, sometimes it was their place in the world, and sometimes it was simply their sense of ease. So tonight, we have wandered through a quiet history, not of grand battles or loud events, but of subtle pressures and soft consequences, of women who said no. And of the many ways the world responded. Not always with force, but with something slower, something steadier. Something that stayed. And with that, we can let the story gently come to rest. No sharp ending, no sudden conclusion, just a slow fading out, like footsteps disappearing down a long quiet corridor, and you can simply drift. So, let's begin in a world where saying no was not really a complete sentence, not for women. Anyway. Because across much of history, marriage was not just a personal decision. It was a structure, a system, a kind of social glue holding together families, property, alliances, and of course expectations. And if that glue didn't stick, well, people got uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. Now, refusing marriage as a man could be seen as odd, maybe even suspicious, but refusing marriage as a woman, that often crossed into something closer to rebellion. Not loud, dramatic rebellion. No swords or shouting. Just a quiet, stubborn refusal. And somehow, that made it worse. Because a quiet refusal doesn't give anyone something to fight. It just sits there, unmoving, uncooperative, like a cat that has decided it will not get into the box, no matter how nicely you ask. And historically, society did not like that kind of stillness. So let's drift into the first kind of punishment. Not the dramatic kind, not chains or dungeons. No. Something much softer, something that sounds almost polite. Social pressure. Now imagine being a young woman in, say, medieval Europe. You've reached what everyone around you considers a suitable age, which frankly was often alarmingly young. And suddenly, conversations start to shift. Your mother becomes a little more attentive. Your father starts mentioning names. Your relatives begin to visit more often. Always with that same tone. Light, casual, but very focused. Oh, have you met so-and-so? He has land. He has prospects. He has a pulse, which is apparently enough. And at first, it feels like suggestion, like guidance. Just helpful advice from people who clearly know better. But then, you hesitate. You say gently that you're not interested. Maybe you say it once, maybe twice, and suddenly, the tone shifts. Not dramatically, no shouting, just a subtle tightening. Smiles become thinner, silences become longer. And the word no starts to feel heavier. Because now it's not just a preference, it's a problem. Families, especially in structured societies, didn't see marriage as optional. It was part of a larger plan. Land had to be managed. Alliances had to be formed. Wealth had to be preserved. And daughters. Well, daughters were part of that equation. So when a daughter refused marriage, it wasn't seen as personal independence. It was seen as disruption. And disruption needed to be corrected. Now, correction didn't always mean punishment in the way we think of it today. No one was necessarily dragged away immediately. Instead, things became inconvenient. Privileges started to disappear. Maybe you were no longer included in certain gatherings. Maybe your opinions were quietly ignored. Maybe your movements became more restricted. Nothing dramatic. Just a slow narrowing of your world. It's a bit like being gradually edited out of your own life. And over time, that kind of pressure builds. Not loudly, not violently. Just steadily. Like water dripping on stone. Now, if social pressure didn't work, and sometimes it didn't, families would move to something slightly more structured. Financial control. Which, again, sounds very modern, very practical. Almost boring. But in historical terms, it was incredibly powerful. Because many women didn't have independent access to money or property. Their economic security was tied directly to their family. And later, to their husband. So if you refused marriage, you were also, in many cases, refusing the path to financial stability. And families could make that very clear. Support might be reduced. DOWRIES might be withheld. Opportunities for education or travel limited, as they already were, might quietly vanish. And again, none of this required anger. No raised voices, just decisions, calm, reasonable, completely devastating. It created a situation where independence wasn't just difficult. It was nearly impossible. And so many women faced a kind of silent equation. Marry or struggle. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. Just in this slow, grinding reality of everyday life. Now, let's float gently into another layer. Community. Because families were not the only ones invested in a woman's marital status. Oh no, entire communities had opinions, and they were not shy about sharing them. In small towns and villages especially, reputation was everything. People knew each other. They watched each other. They talked. Constantly. So a woman who refused marriage didn't just disappoint her family. She became a topic. A point of discussion. At markets. At gatherings. At quiet little conversations that always seemed to stop when she walked into the room. And the labels started to appear. Difficult. Strange. Uncooperative. Sometimes even unnatural, which is a wonderfully vague way of saying, we don't understand you, and that makes us uncomfortable. And once those labels stick, they're hard to remove. It's like being given a nickname you never asked for, except the nickname quietly shapes how everyone treats you. People become less friendly, less trusting, less willing to include you in the social fabric. And again, no one is shouting. No one is punishing you directly. But the message is very clear. You don't quite belong. Now, for some women, this social isolation was enough to push them toward marriage. Not out of desire, not out of love, just out of exhaustion. Because being constantly watched, quietly judged, and gently excluded is tiring. Very tiring. But not everyone gave in. Some women held their ground, and when that happened, society had a few more tools to try. Let's drift into one of the more structured options. Religious life. Now, at first glance, this might seem like an escape, a kind of alternative path, and in some ways, it was. Joining a convent, for example, allowed women to avoid marriage, to live in a community, to have a defined role. It could even offer education, stability, and a certain level of independence, which sounds surprisingly progressive. But here's the thing, not all entries into religious life were entirely voluntary. Sometimes when a woman refused marriage and became inconvenient, families would gently guide her toward a convent. And by gently, we mean with the same calm, steady pressure used in all the other situations. It was presented as a solution, a respectable one. After all, if you weren't going to marry, you could at least dedicate your life to something acceptable. And once inside, leaving was not exactly simple. So while it wasn't a punishment in the traditional sense, it was still a form of control, a way to redirect a life that refused to follow the expected script. Now, to be fair, some women genuinely chose this path and found fulfillment in it. This isn't a story of pure misery, but for others, it was less a calling and more a compromise, a quiet surrender to a system that didn't offer many options. And if even that didn't work, well, things could become a little more direct. Let's not rush there just yet. Instead, let's pause for a moment and notice something. None of these punishments involve dramatic violence. No grand scenes, no theatrical consequences. Just pressure, subtle, persistent, and incredibly effective. Because when an entire society is aligned in one direction, resisting, it doesn't just require courage, it requires endurance. The kind of endurance that wears thin over time. Now imagine living in that environment, day after day, conversation after conversation, expectation after expectation, all pointing toward one outcome. Marriage. And you quietly saying no. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just no. It's almost peaceful in a way, until you realize how much effort it takes to maintain that stillness, and how many small, quiet consequences follow you because of it. So as we continue drifting through this topic, keep that image in mind. Not a dramatic rebellion, not a loud refusal. Just a calm, steady resistance, and a world that responds by slowly, gently tightening around it. Next, we'll ease into a slightly sharper edge of this story, because while pressure and isolation were common, they were not the only responses. Sometimes, the consequences became more visible, more structured, and just a little less polite. So, we left things in a fairly quiet place. A woman says no, society sighs, and then, very gently begins to close in. Now let's drift a little further along that same path, to the point where patience starts to wear thin, because there's only so long a family or a community can keep up the polite version of disappointment. Eventually, someone decides that a firmer hand might be helpful, and this is where consequences begin to look a bit more structured. Still not dramatic, still no thunder or lightning. Just rules. Very specific, very inconvenient rules. In many parts of the world, especially in medieval and early modern Europe, women were legally under the authority of a male guardian, usually a father, sometimes a brother, eventually, ideally, a husband. And if that final transition into marriage didn't happen, things got awkward, because an unmarried woman didn't fit neatly into the system. She wasn't quite independent, but she also wasn't moving into the next expected role. So the law, being wonderfully inflexible, often responded by tightening control. A father, for example, might legally restrict his daughter's movements. Nothing too dramatic. Just small limitations. Where you go, who you see, when you return. It's all framed as protection, of course, because it always is. But the effect is containment. A life that becomes smaller, not through force, but through boundaries that slowly close in. And if the refusal continues, those boundaries can become more permanent. Let's talk about confinement. Now, before we imagine stone towers and locked doors, let's adjust the image slightly. Confinement, in many cases, looked more like being kept at home. Constantly. No independent outings. No unsupervised visits. Just a very controlled environment, where every movement is observed. It's not a prison, technically, but it's not freedom either. It's a kind of in-between space, a holding pattern, where time passes, but nothing changes, and the goal is simple: wear her down. Because the assumption, often unspoken, but very present, was that refusal came from stubbornness, or confusion, or some temporary emotional state. And if you could just limit options, reduce distractions, apply steady pressure, eventually she would agree. Now, sometimes this worked. Sometimes it didn't, single quotes. And when it didn't, families could escalate. Let's float very gently into something a bit more formal. Legal consequences. Because in certain places and times, refusing marriage, especially an arranged one, could actually brush up against the law. Not always directly. No one wrote a law that said, you must marry. That would be a bit too obvious. But there were laws about obedience. About family authority, about contracts and agreements. And if a marriage had been arranged, especially one involving property or alliances, refusing it could be interpreted as a breach, which meant consequences. Fines. For example, a family might lose money if a planned marriage didn't go through. And that loss didn't just disappear. It had to be accounted for. So pressure increased. Because now, the refusal wasn't just emotional or social. It was financial. And financial problems tend to make people less patient. In some cases, courts could become involved. Not in a dramatic, courtroom drama way. More like a quiet, bureaucratic process. Papers filed, complaints made, decisions issued. And those decisions often lean toward maintaining social order, which, at the time, meant encouraging or enforcing marriage. Now, enforcement didn't always mean forcing a wedding at sword point. It was usually more subtle, more procedural. A woman might be declared under stricter guardianship. Her ability to make decisions, already limited, could be reduced even further. In extreme cases, her refusal could be framed as disobedience. And disobedience was something societies tended to correct. Firmly. Now, let's pause here for a moment, because this is where the tone shifts. Just slightly. We're still in calm territory, still moving slowly. But there's an edge now, a sense that the system is running out of patience. And when systems run out of patience, they tend to reveal their sharper tools. Let's drift into one of those tools. Public shame. Now, this one is surprisingly effective, because it doesn't require laws or confinement or even family involvement. It just requires people. And people, historically, have been very good at making each other uncomfortable. In some communities, women who resisted marriage could be openly mocked, not violently, just persistently. Little comments. Side glances, songs, even, in some cases. Yes, actual songs. Humans have always enjoyed turning social disapproval into catchy tunes, and the message was always the same: you are not behaving as expected, and we are going to remind you of that. Constantly. In certain places, this could escalate into more formal displays, public scolding, being called out in gatherings, having your refusal discussed, analyzed, and quietly criticized in front of others. Again, no shouting. Just exposure. And exposure can be powerful, because it turns a private decision into a public identity. You're no longer just someone who doesn't want to marry. You're that woman, the one who refuses, the one who doesn't fit. And once that identity settles in, it becomes very hard to escape. Now, not every community went this far. Some were more relaxed, some families were more understanding. But in many structured societies, conformity was valued, and deviation was corrected, gently at first. And then, less gently. Now, let's ease into something a little more institutional. Because when families and communities couldn't resolve the situation, they sometimes handed it over to institutions. Places designed to maintain order, to guide behavior, to reshape lives. We've already touched on convents, but there were other forms of institutional life. Workhouses, charitable homes, places where unmarried women could be sent under the guise of care. And again, this wasn't always framed as punishment. It was presented as support, a place to live. To work. To be productive. But the underlying message was clear. If you're not going to follow the expected path, we will find a place for you, even if you didn't choose it. And once inside these systems, options became limited. Routine replaced choice. Structure replaced independence. And over time, the edges of resistance could wear down, not through force, but through repetition. Now, it's important to remember, not every story ended in defeat. Some women held their ground. They navigated these pressures. They found ways to live outside the expected norms, quietly, carefully, sometimes with the support of allies. But those stories were the exceptions. And exceptions, by definition, are rare. So as we continue, let's keep following the more common path, the one shaped by expectation, and what happens when expectation is not met. Because we're about to drift into the part of the story where consequences become a little more visible. Still not dramatic. Still not loud. Harder to ignore. A little more tangible. A little more permanent. And just a bit less polite. So, we've reached that final quiet stage, the point where resistance is no longer an active struggle, where no one is really trying to convince her anymore. Because, in a way, the decision has already been made, not by her, but around her, and it happens slowly. So slowly that it almost feels natural, like something that was always going to unfold this way. Now by this stage, a woman who refused marriage has usually settled into a kind of fixed identity. Not officially, no document declares it, but socially, it's understood. She's not going to marry, and once that becomes accepted, the tone shifts again. Interestingly, the pressure doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. Because now, instead of trying to move her toward marriage, society starts organizing itself around her absence from it, which sounds subtle, and it is, but it also means her life is being quietly arranged into a narrower path, one that doesn't leave much room for change. Let's begin with something that feels almost gentle, routine, because many unmarried women, especially as they aged, found themselves drawn into repetitive, predictable roles, caring for elderly relatives, managing household tasks, supporting extended family structures. And on the surface, these roles were respectable. Even valued. They required patience, responsibility, quiet endurance, but they also had a certain stillness to them, a sense that time moved. But life didn't quite expand. Days began to resemble each other, weeks folded into months, and the larger world marriages, celebrations, shifting family lines continued without them at the center. They were present, always present, but rarely the focus. Now, in some ways, this offered a kind of stability. A life without the uncertainties of marriage. No difficult spouse. No political alliances to navigate. No expectations of producing heirs. And for some women, that was not entirely unwelcome, but there was also a quiet trade-off. Because stability, in this case, often came at the cost of visibility. Of recognition. Of being seen as someone with a future that still held possibilities. Instead, her life became something already understood, already categorized. And once a life is categorized, it tends to stop surprising people. Now, let's drift gently into another layer, emotional consequence. Because while the historical record often focuses on structure, laws, customs, expectations, it rarely lingers on how these experiences felt. But we can imagine, not in a dramatic way, not with intense scenes or overwhelming emotion, just quietly. Imagine living in a world where your choices are constantly interpreted through someone else's expectations, where your refusal isn't just a decision, but a statement others feel the need to explain, where your life becomes a kind of example, a cautionary one, sometimes. And over time, that might settle into something like acceptance. Or maybe something softer. Resignation. Not the dramatic kind, just a gradual understanding that things will not change, that this is the shape of your life, and you will live it as it is. Now, it's important to pause here and say something clearly. Not every unmarried woman was unhappy. That would be far too simple, too neat. History is rarely that tidy. Some women found contentment in their independence, in the quiet control they had over their own routines, in the absence of obligations that marriage often brought. Some built meaningful relationships outside of traditional structures, friendships, extended family bonds, even intellectual or creative pursuits. And those lives mattered. Even if they weren't always recorded in the same way. But even in those cases, the surrounding system didn't change. The expectations remained. The structure held. And choosing a different path meant constantly existing just slightly outside of it. Now, let's float toward one final idea. Legacy. Because for many people in history, legacy was tied to family. To children. To continuation. And a woman who didn't marry often didn't fit into that narrative. Her story didn't extend in the same visible way. No descendants to carry her name. No lineage to trace. And so, in many records, she simply fades. Not dramatically. Just quietly. A name that appears briefly and then disappears. Which in a way, is its own kind of consequence. Not punishment in the traditional sense, but a kind of historical silence. Now as we reach the end of this slow, steady journey, it's worth noticing something. At no point did we encounter a single universal punishment. No one rule. No one law that applied everywhere, to everyone. Instead, we saw a pattern, a collection of responses. Pressure. Isolation. Restriction. Reputation. Redirection. And finally, quiet acceptance. A system that didn't need to be loud or violent to be effective, because it was everywhere. In families. In communities. In expectations. That shaped daily life. And in that kind of system, punishment doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like normal life, just slightly smaller, slightly quieter, slightly more confined. So the next time we think about resistance in history, it might be tempting to imagine dramatic acts, loud defiance, clear consequences, but often it looked like this. A woman, somewhere in a small room, being asked a question she had already answered. And answering it again. Calmly. Softly. No. And then living. With everything that followed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just slowly, like everything else in this story. And with that, we can let this one gently fade out. No grand ending. No final twist. Just a quiet understanding of how something as simple as refusing marriage could shape an entire life. And how a world built on expectation responds when someone chooses not to follow it. So, let's begin in a place that feels oddly luxurious and slightly uncomfortable at the same time. A royal court, polished floors, heavy curtains, too many candles, and just enough perfume in the air to suggest that people are trying very hard to ignore something. And somewhere in this carefully arranged world, there is a woman who does not quite belong, not officially, but also very much present. She is not the queen. That role is taken, usually by someone selected for politics, alliances, or land. Not necessarily for love, or compatibility, or even basic conversation. And she is not a servant either. Servants at least have clear roles, clear expectations. She exists in that strange floating space in between. She is the mistress. Now that word today carries a certain tone, a mix of scandal and curiosity. But in many royal courts, especially in places like France and England, it was almost an institution. Which is a polite way of saying everyone knew. And no one really stopped it, because kings, as it turns out, were not particularly interested in limiting themselves. Shocking. I know. Now imagine being that woman. You are close to power. Very close. Closer in some ways than the queen herself. You might have the king's attention, his affection, his time. Which, in a court full of people competing for influence, is incredibly valuable. But at the same time, you have no official title. No legal protection. No guaranteed future. It's a bit like living in a very beautiful house that you don't own, and could be asked to leave at any moment. And yet, many women stepped into this role. Sometimes willingly, sometimes carefully, sometimes because, well, opportunity has a way of presenting itself in very specific forms. Let's float over to one of the most famous examples of this quiet, unofficial power. A woman who managed to turn the role of mistress into something almost administrative. Her name was Madame de Pompadour. Now she wasn't born into extreme power. She wasn't royalty, but she was intelligent. Very intelligent. And charming. Exceptionally so. Which, as it turns out, is a useful combination when navigating a court filled with egos the size of small kingdoms. She became the official mistress of King Louis XV of France. And yes, official mistress sounds like a contradiction, but that's exactly what she was. She had apartments at court. She hosted gatherings. She influenced decisions. And perhaps most impressively, she maintained her position even after her romantic relationship with the king cooled, which is not something most mistresses manage to do, because usually the role came with an expiration date, a very uncertain one. Now, Madame de Pompadour handled this by becoming indispensable. She wasn't just a romantic partner. She became a confidant, an advisor, a cultural figure. She supported the arts, encouraged architecture, helped shape the aesthetic of the court. In other words, she made herself useful, extremely useful, because when your position depends entirely on one person's favor, you learn very quickly how to remain valuable. Now, let's gently slide to a slightly different situation, because not every mistress had that level of control. In fact, most didn't. For many women, becoming a royal mistress was less about strategy and more about circumstance. They might be introduced at court, noticed, favored, and suddenly, their lives change rapidly. They move into better rooms, wear finer clothes, receive gifts, jewelry, land, titles, sometimes. And from the outside, it looks like a fairy tale, except it isn't, because everything they have is conditional, entirely dependent on staying in favor. In favor is a fragile thing, especially in a royal court. Now imagine waking up each day knowing that your position depends on remaining interesting, charming, pleasant, never too demanding, never too distant, perfectly balanced. It's a bit like walking a tightrope. In a very expensive dress, while everyone watches, and occasionally whispers. Yes, the whispers, because while the king might be quite comfortable with the arrangement, not everyone else is. The queen, for example. Now, queens often had to tolerate mistresses, which is a very calm way of describing a deeply uncomfortable situation. Some queens ignored it, some resented it quietly, some managed to build polite relationships with the mistress, which is honestly impressive in a very restrained, emotionally complex way. Because imagine being married to a king for political reasons, and then watching another woman receive his affection publicly, and everyone just accepts it. Court life required a level of emotional control that feels almost unreal. Now, beyond the queen, there were courtiers, nobles, advisors, all watching, all calculating, because a mistress wasn't just a personal relationship. She was a political factor. If she had influence over the king, then gaining her favor could mean access to power, which meant people would approach her, flatter her, bring gifts, offer alliances, and suddenly, she's not just managing a relationship, she's managing a network, a web of expectations, requests, quiet negotiations, all while maintaining the illusion that she's simply there for companionship. Now, let's take a soft step into another reality of this role. Jealousy. Not loud, dramatic jealousy. That would be too obvious. More like a constant undercurrent. Because if one mistress exists, another can replace her. Easily. Kings, historically, were not known for their long-term consistency in romantic matters. So even the most favored mistress lived with a kind of quiet uncertainty, always aware that someone younger, or newer, or simply different, could appear. And shift everything. And when that shift happened, it was rarely announced. No formal goodbye. No clear transition. Just a gradual cooling, fewer visits, shorter conversations. Less attention, until one day, it becomes clear. The position is no longer yours. And then comes the most delicate part. What happens next? For some women, the king would provide a house, a pension, something to ensure they could live comfortably, a kind of soft landing. For others, the transition was less generous. Because again, nothing was guaranteed. And without the king's favor, their position at court could vanish almost instantly. Which brings us to a slightly ironic truth. For all the luxury, all the influence, all the attention, the role of a royal mistress was deeply unstable. It offered access to power, but not security. It offered visibility, but not legitimacy. And it required a constant, careful performance. Now, let's drift gently into another figure, someone who represents a different flavor of this same role. A woman named Nell Gwyn. Now, unlike Madame de Pompadour, Nell Gwyn came from a much more modest background. She was an actress, which at the time was already a somewhat unconventional profession. And then, she caught the attention of King Charles II of England. And just like that, her life changed. But now Gwyn brought something different to the role. She was known for her humor, her wit, her ability to be disarmingly genuine, which made her popular. Not just with the king, but with the public. And that's unusual, because royal mistresses were often viewed with suspicion or quiet disapproval. But Mel had a kind of charm that softened that perception. She didn't try to appear overly refined. She didn't fully blend into aristocratic expectations. And somehow, that worked in her favor. Now, her story reminds us that there wasn't just one way to be a mistress. Some leaned into elegance. Others into intelligence. Others into personality. But all of them shared that same underlying reality. They existed in a space that was powerful and precarious, visible and vulnerable. Now, as we continue drifting through this world, keep that balance in mind, because being a royal mistress wasn't just about romance. Or luxury. Or scandal. It was about navigating a very specific, very delicate position, where every advantage came with a condition. And every moment of comfort carried a quiet question: how long will this last? And with that thought gently settling in, we can ease into the next part of this story, where things become just a little more complicated, a little more layered. And where the personal starts to blend even more deeply with the political. Because in royal courts, nothing stays simple for very long. So we left our royal mistress balancing very carefully on that invisible line, comfortable but not secure, admired but not fully accepted, and always aware that everything she has exists because one very important person continues to be interested, which is, admittedly, a slightly stressful foundation for a lifestyle built on silk cushions and gold-trimmed furniture. Now, let's drift into what made this position truly fascinating. Not the romance, not even the luxury, but the influence. Because, despite having no official title, many royal mistresses held remarkable sway over the people who did, and in a court setting, that mattered more than almost anything. Imagine for a moment the daily life of a king: meetings, petitions, endless conversations about land, money, and alliances, all delivered in very serious tones, often by very serious men. It's exhausting just thinking about it. And then, at the end of the day, there's someone who offers something different. Not demands. Not politics. Just ease, conversation that flows, laughter, maybe, or simply a presence that feels less heavy. That space, quiet, relaxed, personal, was where influence quietly grew, not through commands, but through suggestion. A gentle comment here, a passing opinion there, a name mentioned casually. And slowly, those small moments could shape decisions. Now, this wasn't always deliberate. Not every mistress was sitting there plotting state policy between cups of wine. But the access alone made a difference, because when you have the king's ear, even in informal settings, you have something others desperately want. Which brings us to the court, that wonderfully intricate environment where everyone is watching everyone else all the time. And once a mistress becomes established, people begin to notice. Carefully. Strategically. Because gaining her favor could mean gaining access to the king, and losing her favor could quietly close doors. So suddenly, she's not just navigating her relationship with the king, she's managing attention from all directions. Nobles offering compliments, advisors presenting ideas, courtiers appearing just a little too often in the same rooms. It's a bit like becoming the center of a very polite storm. Everything moves around you, but nothing ever feels completely still. Now, some women handled this beautifully. They became skilled at reading people. At understanding intentions. At deciding who to support and who to gently ignore. Others found it overwhelming, because managing influence requires a kind of awareness that never really switches off. Every conversation matters. Every reaction is observed. And every small decision can ripple outward. Now, let's take a soft step into something slightly more complicated. Jealousy. But not the obvious kind. We've already touched on the possibility of being replaced. that quiet, ever-present risk. But there's another form of tension here, the queen. Now the queen's role was official, recognized, secure in a way the mistress could never be. But security doesn't always come with affection, and in many cases, it didn't, so you end up with this strange dynamic. The queen represents duty, the mistress represents desire, and both exist in the same space, which is, to put it mildly, awkward. Now, reactions varied. Some queens maintained distance, a kind of dignified silence. Others engaged in subtle rivalry. Nothing dramatic. Just small shifts. A cooler greeting, a longer pause, a carefully chosen absence, and occasionally, a quiet assertion of status. Because while the mistress might have influence, the queen had legitimacy. And that difference mattered a lot. Now, from the mistress's perspective, this required careful navigation. Too much confidence could seem disrespectful. Too much humility could invite dismissal. So again, balance. Always balance. And this brings us to something that doesn't get discussed very often: emotional labor. Because being a royal mistress wasn't just about charm. It was about maintaining a very specific emotional environment. You had to be pleasant, consistently, supportive, but not overbearing, engaging, but never exhausting. And perhaps most importantly, you had to make the king feel understood. Which sounds simple, but ISN single quotes did. Because understanding someone in that position means adapting constantly. To moods, to changes, to the unpredictable rhythm of royal life. And doing all of that without the security of a defined role. Now, let's drift into another reality. Rivalry, not just from potential new mistresses, but from everyone else. Because influence attracts attention, and attention attracts competition. Courtiers might resent her, nobles might distrust her, advisors might see her as an obstacle, or worse, as someone who could undo their carefully planned strategies with a single casual comment. So behind the polite smiles, there's tension, quiet, controlled tension. People watching. Waiting. Looking for moments where she might slip. Because if she does, even slightly, it could be used against her. Now, again, this isn't loud or dramatic. No confrontations in grand halls. Just subtle shifts. A rumor here, a suggestion there, a slight change in how she's treated, and over time, those small things can build. Now, let's pause for a moment. Because all of this, the influence, the attention, the pressure, it creates a kind of illusion. From the outside, it looks like power, real, tangible power. And in some ways, it is, but it's also conditional. Fragile. Dependent on factors that can change without warning. Which means that every advantage comes with a quiet awareness. This could end. At any time. Now some mistresses prepared for this. They secured property. Built connections, arranged for a future beyond the court. Others lived more in the moment, focused on the present. The comfort, the attention, and hoped, perhaps, that it would last. Sometimes it did. Often, it didn't. Single quotes. Now, let's gently return to something we touched on earlier. Identity. Because over time, the role of mistress begins to shape how a woman sees herself and how others see her. She is no longer just an individual. She is a position, a function within the court, and that can be disorienting. Because what happens when the role disappears? Who is she, then? Now, some women managed this transition well. They stepped away, rebuilt their lives, found new roles, new identities. Others struggled. Because losing that position meant losing not just comfort, but relevance. And relevance, once experienced, is difficult to let go of. Now, as we continue, let's carry that thought with us. This delicate balance between visibility and vulnerability, between influence and instability. Because we're about to drift into a slightly more personal side of this story, where the public role of mistress begins to overlap with something quieter, something more human. Relationships. Attachments. And the subtle, often complicated emotions that come with them. Because behind all the structure, all the expectations, all the carefully maintained appearances, There were still people with feelings, with hopes with moments of connection that didn't always fit neatly into the system, and as we'll see, those moments could make the role even more complicated. Not louder, not more dramatic, just deeper, and perhaps a little more difficult to leave behind. So, we've spent some time in the polished world of influence, careful words, measured smiles, that constant balancing act between being important and not being too important. But now let's drift somewhere quieter, somewhere less structured. Because behind all the strategy and social navigation, there was something else happening, something far less predictable. Feelings. Not dramatic, sweeping romance like in a novel. Nothing that loud. More like gradual attachment, the kind that builds slowly, almost unnoticed. A shared joke that becomes familiar, a routine conversation that becomes expected, a presence that starts to feel comfortable. And in a world as controlled as a royal court, comfort is surprisingly rare. Now imagine being in that position. You're not just performing a role anymore. You're spending real time with someone, listening, talking, observing. And over time, that interaction starts to feel less like an arrangement and more like a connection, which is where things become complicated. Because while the role of mistress was structured around access and favor, human emotion doesn't always follow structure. It tends to wander quietly, unpredictably, and sometimes inconveniently. Now, let's be gentle with this. Not every royal mistress fell in love, and not every king offered something that could even resemble affection. Some relationships were purely practical, transactional even, a kind of unspoken agreement where both sides understood the terms. But in other cases, there was something softer, a familiarity, a dependence, a sense that, within the rigid world of the court, this connection offered something real. And that's where the line begins to blur. Because when something starts to feel real, it becomes harder to treat it as temporary, even when you know, logically, that it is. Now, let's imagine the emotional rhythm of that life. You see the king regularly, perhaps daily. You share conversations that no one else hears, moments that exist outside the formal structure of court life. And slowly, those moments accumulate. They build a kind of quiet intimacy. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just present. And over time, it becomes part of your identity. Part of your routine. Part of how you understand your place in the world. Now, here's where the subtle tension begins. Because while the connection might feel personal, the context remains public. Always. There are still eyes watching, still whispers, still the constant awareness that this relationship exists within a larger system, one that can shift without warning. So even in moments that feel genuine, there's a layer of caution, a quiet awareness in the background. This could change. Now let's gently turn the perspective, because attachment doesn't only happen on one side. Kings, despite their well-documented unpredictability, were still human. And some did form attachments, not always deep, not always lasting, but real in their own way, which created another layer of complexity. Because if a king grows accustomed to a certain presence, a certain voice, a certain kind of ease, that connection can become important. Not officially. But personally. And that personal importance can influence behavior. Decisions. Time. Attention. Which, again, circles back to influence. But now through a more emotional lens. Now let's pause for a moment and consider something quietly interesting. This kind of relationship exists in a strange overlap between freedom and limitation. On one hand, it can feel more relaxed than a royal marriage, less bound by duty, more open, perhaps. But on the other hand, it lacks security. It has no structure to hold it in place. So everything depends on continuation. On things staying the same. Which, historically, they rarely did. Now, let's drift into the part that is often left unspoken. Endings. Because no matter how comfortable, how familiar, how quietly meaningful a relationship becomes. The role of mistress almost always came to an end. Sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, but always, inevitably. And the nature of that ending could shape everything that followed. Now we've touched on the idea of favor fading, that slow cooling. But when emotions are involved, that process feels different. Heavier. Because it's not just a change in position. It's a change in connection. Conversations become less frequent. Less personal. The easy rhythm that once existed begins to shift, and even if nothing is said directly, the difference is felt. Now imagine experiencing that shift in a place where you cannot openly react, where dignity must be maintained, where emotion must be carefully managed. Because everything is still being observed. It's a very quiet kind of difficulty. One that doesn't show itself outwardly, but settles internally. Now, when the relationship finally ends, there's often a kind of silence around it. No formal acknowledgement. No clear closure. Just a transition. From presence to absence. And then comes the question we've circled before. What now? Now here's where things become very individual. Some women moved forward with remarkable composure. They accepted the change, adjusted their lives, carried their experiences with a kind of quiet confidence. Others found it more difficult. Because leaving that role meant leaving behind not just comfort, but connection. And connection, once formed, doesn't simply disappear. It lingers, softly, in memory. In habit. In the small spaces where routine used to exist. Now, let's take one more gentle step, because there's another layer here. One that adds a subtle weight to the entire experience. Children. Yes. Sometimes these relationships resulted in children. And those children occupied their own unique position, recognized, but not always fully integrated. Provided for, but not always equal. And for the mother, this created a lasting connection to the court, even after the relationship itself had ended, which could be comforting or complicated, or both. Now, as we let this part settle, there's something worth noticing. The role of a royal mistress was not just a social or political position. It was also a deeply human experience, filled with small, quiet emotions, attachments that formed slowly, and endings that arrived just as quietly. No dramatic exits. No final declarations. Just change. Soft, steady, and unavoidable. And with that, we begin to move toward the final stretch of this story, where everything we've explored, power, influence, emotion, starts to settle into something more lasting. Reputation. Legacy. And the quiet question of how these women were remembered once the court moved on. Because in a world that thrives on attention, what happens when the attention fades? Let's drift there, slowly. So we arrive at that final, very soft stage, the part where the candles have burned low, the music has stopped, and the court, in its endlessly shifting rhythm, has already begun to move on. Because that is what courts do. They do not pause. They do not linger. They simply continue. And for a royal mistress, this moment when her role has ended, her presence no longer central, is perhaps the most delicate part of all. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just quiet. Now, let's imagine that transition. At one point, she was everywhere. In conversations. In decisions. In the small, private moments that shaped larger outcomes. People watched her, approached her. Measured their words around her. And now, that attention begins to drift elsewhere. Not abruptly. Just gradually. A new face appears. A new favorite emerges. And the center of the room shifts. It's almost graceful. In a way, how seamlessly a court can rearrange itself. And yet, for the person stepping out of that center, it can feel like a slow retreat from visibility into something softer. More distant. Now, here's where things become quietly interesting. Because what remains after the role ends is not just memory. It's reputation. And reputation, in a place like a royal court, is something that lingers, sometimes gently, sometimes less so. Let's start with the more generous version. A mistress who handled her position with grace, who navigated influence carefully, who avoided unnecessary conflict, who perhaps supported the arts or contributed to the cultural life of the court. She might be remembered. Kindly. Not officially celebrated, but spoken of with a certain softness. A clever woman, a charming presence, someone who understood her place and moved through it with skill. Now, that kind of reputation doesn't guarantee anything grand. No statues, no major historical titles, but it does offer something quieter. Respect. A kind of lingering acknowledgement that, within the limitations of her role, she did well. Now, let's gently turn to the other side, because not every story was remembered so kindly. A mistress who was seen as too ambitious, too visible, too involved in matters that others felt she shouldn't touch, might be remembered differently. Whispers linger. Stories shift, and over time, her image can become less flattering. Not through any single event, just through accumulation. A rumor here, a comment there. Until the memory of her becomes shaped more by perception than by reality. Now, here's the subtle irony. Both of these reputations, positive or negative, are built on the same foundation. Role that was never officially recognized, which means everything about it is interpreted. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is fully recorded in a neutral way. And so, these women often exist in history as impressions. Fragments. Glimpses, shaped by the people who chose to write about them. Now let's drift into something even quieter, life after the court. Because once the role ends, life continues. It has to. And what that life looks like varies. Some women lived comfortably, supported by pensions, property, or arrangements made during their time in favor. They might retreat to a smaller estate, a quieter environment. Where the pace of life slows. Where the constant observation of court fades into something more manageable. And in that space, they could redefine themselves, not as a mistress, but simply as a person. Now that transition could be peaceful, even welcome. After all, the court was not an easy place to exist. It required constant awareness, constant adjustment. So stepping away from that could feel like a release, but it could also feel empty. Because going from the center of attention to relative quiet is not always a smooth shift. It takes time. And not everyone found it easy. Now for others, the transition was less comfortable. Without strong support, without secured resources, life after the court could become uncertain. More practical. More grounded. Which is a gentle way of saying less glamorous. And again, this highlights that central truth we've been circling. The role offered access, but not guarantees. Now, let's take one final step. Legacy. Because in the grand sweep of history, royal mistresses occupy a very particular space. They are remembered, but rarely centered. Not quite footnotes, but not main figures either. They exist in the margins of larger stories, connected to kings. To courts. To moments of influence, but often defined by those connections, rather than by themselves. And yet, when we look a little closer, their lives reveal something quietly fascinating. They navigated one of the most complex social environments imaginable, without formal authority, without clear protection, relying on intelligence, adaptability, and an almost constant awareness of shifting dynamics. They balanced visibility and vulnerability, influence and instability, connection and uncertainty, all at the same time. And they did it quietly. No grand declarations. No official recognition. Just presence, carefully maintained. Now, as we let this story settle, there's something almost calming about it. Not because it's simple, but because it moves so steadily. From rise to balance, to change to memory. A soft arc, without sharp edges, without dramatic peaks, just a continuous, gentle flow. And within that flow, a life shaped by circumstance. By opportunity. By the quiet decisions made in rooms filled with candlelight and conversation. So when we think about royal mistresses, it's easy to focus on the surface. The luxury, the intrigue, the closeness to power. But underneath all of that, There's something more subtle, a life lived in between, not fully inside the structure, not fully outside it. Just carefully navigating the space in between. And perhaps that's what makes these stories linger. Not the drama. Not the scandal, but the quiet complexity of a role that offered everything and promised nothing. And with that, we can let the court slowly fade into the background. The voices soften, the lights dim, and the story gently comes to rest. So, let's begin in a place that doesn't look like a battlefield. No armor. No banners. No dramatic speeches echoing across hills. Just a village, a few houses, a patch of farmland, maybe a small well in the center, the kind of place where life moves slowly and predictably. Or at least, it tries to, because even when war happens somewhere else, it has a way of arriving anyway. Quietly. Gradually. Like bad weather you didn't plan for. Now imagine being a peasant woman in that village. Your life, before anything changes, is already full. Not in a poetic way. In a very practical, very repetitive way. You wake early, you work, you cook, you carry water. You tend the animals, you mend things that will break again tomorrow. And then, you sleep, not because everything is done, but because your body simply stops cooperating. It's a rhythm. A steady, predictable rhythm. And then, war begins. Not in your village, of course. At first, it's somewhere else. Always somewhere else. You hear about it through travelers. Through rumors. Through that one person who always seems to know things, and never quite explains how. And at first, it feels distant. Almost abstract. Kings arguing, borders shifting, names you've heard, but never seen. It doesn't feel like something that belongs to you. But then, slowly, it gets closer. Because wars historically are very bad at staying contained. They move. Armies travel, supplies are needed, routes are taken, and villages, like yours, are very conveniently located along those routes. Now let's not rush this moment, because the arrival of war is rarely dramatic. No sudden explosions. No cinematic scenes. Just signs. Small ones. Fields that don't get tended because someone has left. Men who don't return at the usual time. Conversations that stop when you walk into the room. And then, one day, soldiers appear. Not in formation. Not marching in perfect lines. Just present. Tired, dusty, hungry. And suddenly the world you knew feels different. Not destroyed. Just unsettled. Now for peasant women, this shift brought a very specific kind of change, because when war arrives, men often leave. To fight. To serve, or simply because they are taken, and that leaves behind a different kind of responsibility. The work doesn't stop. In fact, it increases. Because now everything that was shared becomes yours. The fields. The animals. The repairs. The constant, endless cycle of tasks that keep a household functioning. And you do it. Not dramatically, not heroically. Just because it has to be done. Now imagine waking up before dawn. Not because it's your routine, but because you have no choice. There's more to do. Less help, and no guarantee that things will improve anytime soon. It's a quiet kind of pressure. One that doesn't shout, but sits there every single day. Now, let's drift into something even more subtle. Uncertainty. Because war doesn't just bring physical change. It brings not knowing. You don't know when or if the men will return. You don't know if the harvest will be enough. You don't know if the soldiers passing through will be peaceful or not. And that uncertainty becomes part of daily life, like an extra weight you carry without thinking about it. Now, here's something quietly important. Peasant women were not passive in this situation. They adapted. They adjusted. They found ways to keep things going. Because survival, in that context, wasn't a dramatic act. It was a series of small, continuous decisions. Plant this, fix that. Save a little here, hide a little there. And yes, hiding becomes part of the story. Because when soldiers arrive, they often need supplies. Food. Animals. Anything that can support them. And those supplies come from somewhere. Usually, Your home dot so women learn to be. Careful dot to store things out of sight, dot to keep small reserves hidden. Not out of defiance. Just out of necessity dot, because if everything is taken, there's nothing left dot now. Let's pause and notice something. None of this looks like what we typically imagine when we think about war dot, no battles dot, no strategy dot, just daily life. Under pressure dot, and yet, this is where much of the real impact happens dot, in the quiet spaces dot, in the routines that are disrupted, but must continue anyway. Now let's drift a little further, because as time passes, war doesn't just visit dot, it lingers. Seasons change, crops are planted and harvested, and still, the uncertainty remains dot, and with it comes exhaustion dot, the kind that comes from one long day, but the kind that builds slowly, over weeks dot, months dot, years dot, because carrying responsibility without relief tends to wear people down dot, quietly dot. Now, in some villages, communities came together, women supporting each other, sharing work, sharing resources, because when systems break down, people often create smaller systems of their own, more personal, more immediate, and those connections mattered dot, a lot dot, because isolation, in times like this, can be overwhelming, but shared experience softens it, even slightly dot. Now, let's gently move into another layer dot, fear dot, loud, overwhelming fear. That would be too obvious. More like a constant awareness, a sense that things could change quickly, because soldiers passing through are unpredictable. Some are polite, some are not, and there's no reliable way to know which is which dot, so interactions become careful dot, measured dot. You speak when needed, you avoid attention when possible, you learn to read tone, expression, small details dot, because those details can tell you how to respond dot. Now again, this isn't dramatic dot, no sudden scenes, just quiet vigilance, a kind of awareness that never fully switches off. Now as we settle into this first part, there's something worth holding on to. The lives of peasant women during war were not defined by a single moment, not by one event, but by a continuous process of adjustment, a steady navigation through changing conditions that where survival depended not on grand actions, but on small, consistent choices. And as we continue, we'll drift deeper into those choices, into the ways women adapted not just to work and uncertainty, but to loss dot, to change dot, and to the quiet reshaping of a life that once felt predictable. Let's move there, slowly. So, we left our village in that quiet, unsettled state, not destroyed, not peaceful either, just stretched dot, like something pulled a little too tight, but not yet broken. And at the center of that tension, peasant women continue their work, because work doesn't pause for war dot, it doesn't wait for things to stabilize dot, it simply continues dot. Only now, it asks more dot, much more. Let's drift into a typical day dot, not an extraordinary one dot, just an ordinary day. In the middle of all this dot, morning arrives early dot, it always has, but now there's a slight heaviness to it dot, because before your eyes even open fully, your mind is already listing what needs to be done dot, fields dot, animals dot, food dot, repairs, water dot, everything dot, and there's no one to share that list with anymore dot, so you get up, you move, you begin dot. Now, the fields are perhaps the most demanding part, because crops don't care about war. They grow when they grow. They need tending when they need tending. And if they are neglected, even briefly, the consequences come later dot, quietly dot, in smaller harvests dot, in thinner meals dot, in that slow realization that there won't be enough dot, so the work in the fields continues dot, plowing, if possible, planting dot, weeding dot, harvesting dot, all tasks that were once shared, now managed by fewer hands, and those hands grow tired, but they don't stop, because stopping is not really an option dot. Now, let's take a moment here, because this kind of labor isn't dramatic dot, it's repetitive dot, steady dot, almost rhythmic dot, and in that rhythm, there's a strange kind of stability. Even when everything else feels uncertain, you know what needs to be done, you know how to do it dot, and so you do it dot. Now, Let's move slightly to the side of the field, toward the home, because while the fields demand attention, the household hasn't disappeared. If anything, it demands more. Cooking, for example, becomes more complicated. Because ingredients are not always available, supplies are limited, and what you have needs to last. So meals become simpler, more careful, every portion measured, even if not formally. You learn to stretch things. To make something out of very little. A handful of grain becomes a meal. A few vegetables become something that has to satisfy. Not because it's enough, but because it has to be. Now let's gently step into another part of this daily rhythm. Mending. Clothing wears out, tools break, and replacing them is not always possible. So you repair. Again and again. Stitching fabric that has already been stitched before, fixing tools that were never meant to last this long, and over time, everything begins to show signs of use. Layers of repair. Marks of survival. Now, here's something quietly fascinating. This constant process of fixing becomes a skill. An expertise not learned in a formal way. Just through necessity, through repetition, through the simple need to keep things functioning. Now, let's drift into something a little more emotional. Absence. Because while the work fills the day, there are moments when it pauses. Briefly. And in those moments, there's space to notice who isn't there. A place at the table. A voice that used to be part of conversation. A task that used to be shared. And that absence is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet. A small gap in the rhythm of life. But it's there. Consistently. Now, let's not linger too long. Because life doesn't allow for extended pauses. There's always something else to do. Something that pulls attention back to the present. And that, in a way, becomes a kind of coping. Not ignoring. Just continuing. Now, let's shift gently toward the idea of resources. Because during war, resources become unpredictable. What was once reliable may no longer be. Trade slows. Travel becomes risky. Goods become scarce. And so, people adapt. Bartering becomes more common. Small exchanges. A bit of grain for a bit of cloth. A service for a favor. Nothing formal. Just practical. And women often played a central role in this. Managing what little was available. Deciding what could be spared. And what had to be kept. Now, these decisions are not easy. Because every choice has a consequence. Give too much, and you risk running out. Keep too much, and you risk damaging relationships. So balance becomes essential. Again, that quiet theme of balance. Always present. Now, let's drift into something that feels almost invisible. Time. Because war changes how time is experienced. Days feel longer, but also somehow blur together. Weeks pass, but it's hard to mark them. There are fewer celebrations. Fewer events. Fewer moments that stand out. So time becomes measured differently. By work completed. By small changes. By survival. And in that sense, each day becomes both important and indistinguishable from the last. Now, let's gently step into another layer. Children. Because children are still there, still growing, still needing care. And their presence adds another dimension to everything. Because while you manage the work, you also manage their understanding, or perhaps their lack of understanding. They ask questions. Simple ones. Where is father? Why are things different? And the answers are not always clear. So you respond in ways that are careful, reassuring, if possible, even when you're not entirely sure yourself. Now this requires a kind of emotional strength, a quiet steadiness. Because children look for stability. And in a world that feels unstable, someone has to provide that, even if it's just an appearance of it. Now, as we let this part settle, there's something worth noticing again. The lives of peasant women during war were not defined by single dramatic events, but by an accumulation. Work without pause, decisions without certainty. Responsibility without relief. And yet, life continued. Fields were tended. Meals were prepared. Clothes were mended. Children were raised. all within a world that felt slightly off balance. And as we move forward, we'll drift into the next layer of this experience, one that touches on something even more delicate. Loss, always sudden, not always visible, but present, in ways that quietly shape everything else. Let's go there. Slowly. So, we're still in the same village. Same fields. Same houses. Same slow rhythm of daily life that refuses to stop, even when everything around it feels slightly out of place. But now, something has changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Just enough that it can't be ignored anymore. People are not just away. Some of them are not coming back. And in the life of a peasant woman during war, that realization doesn't arrive like a loud moment. It arrives like a pattern. A delay that becomes longer than expected. A return that doesn't happen at the usual time. A familiar figure that slowly stops appearing in the places they used to be. And at first, of course, there is hope. Because hope is efficient like that. It fills gaps automatically. Oh, maybe they were delayed. Maybe they had to stay longer. Maybe the roads are difficult. All very reasonable explanations, until they slowly stop being enough. Now, let's stay gentle here. Because in these villages, there were no official messages. No formal announcements. No clean explanations delivered with certainty. Just information that drifted in. Through travelers. Through rumors. Through the careful way people avoided saying certain names too directly. And so, understanding came slowly, piece by piece, until it settled into something heavier, something unspoken, but widely understood. Now, for peasant women, this kind of loss doesn't pause life. It folds into it, because there is still work to do. Always. The fields still need attention. Animals still need care. Children still need feeding. And so the day continues, even while something inside it feels different. Now, let's not rush past that, because this is one of the most quietly important aspects of life in wartime. Loss does not always create a stopping point. It often creates a continuation, a life that keeps moving, with something missing inside it, and that missing becomes part of the rhythm. Now let's gently move into something more practical, because when a household loses a worker, whether through death, capture, or disappearance, the structure of daily life shifts. Immediately. Tasks that were once shared are redistributed. Responsibilities expand, and the woman at the center of the household often absorbs them without choice. Not because she is prepared, but because there is no alternative. So she adjusts. Again. Always adjusting. Now, this is where endurance stops feeling like a concept and becomes a daily reality. Not heroic endurance. Not dramatic endurance. Just continuing, even when everything requires more effort than before. Now, let's drift into something slightly different. Community response. Because while loss is personal, it is also shared. Other households are going through similar changes. Other women are managing similar absences. And in that shared experience, something develops. Not formal support. Not structured assistance, but something quieter. Mutual awareness. People checking in on each other in small ways, sharing what little they have when possible, helping with tasks that feel too heavy for one person alone. And in a world where institutions are distant or disrupted, this kind of informal support becomes essential. Not always consistent, not always enough, but present. And that presence matters. Now, let's gently move into another layer. Memory. Because even as life continues, the people who are gone do not simply disappear from thought. They remain. In routines, in habits. In the way certain tasks are remembered as being done together. A field that was once worked by two people. A repair that used to be shared. A conversation that no longer happens. And these memories don't arrive all at once. They surface quietly, during work, during rest, during brief pauses in the day, when the mind is not fully occupied. And in those moments, absence becomes very noticeable. Not overwhelming. Just present. Now, let's slow down here for a moment, because this is where the emotional reality of wartime peasant life becomes very clear. It is not defined by a single tragedy, but by a continuous coexistence of labor and loss, of routine and disruption, of survival and memory. All happening at the same time. Now, let's drift into something else that changes over time. Responsibility. Because when men are gone, whether for war or not returning, the structure of authority within a household often shifts, and women take on roles that were previously shared or assigned elsewhere. Managing land. Making decisions about resources. Handling interactions with officials or passing soldiers, not because the system has changed to accommodate them, but because it has no other option. So they step into those roles. Carefully. Sometimes cautiously, but necessarily. And over time, competence develops. Not in an acknowledged way, but in practice, because survival demands it. Now, let's gently touch on something that often sits in the background of these stories: uncertainty about return. Because even when someone is not confirmed lost, the uncertainty itself becomes a burden. Is he coming back? When? In what condition? And this uncertainty can last for months or years, and during that time, life continues. Which creates a strange duality: waiting, while also moving forward, holding on to possibility, while managing reality. And that tension is quietly exhausting. Not dramatic. Just persistent. Now, let's drift into something very subtle: change in identity. Because over time, the role of peasant woman during war shifts. She is no longer just managing a household in the traditional sense. She becomes something closer to a central figure of survival, the one who ensures continuity, the one who keeps things functioning when everything else becomes unstable. And that role shapes her, not through recognition, but through necessity. Now, as we begin to settle this part of the story, there's a pattern emerging. War, for peasant women, is not experienced as a series of battles. It is experienced as a long, uneven reshaping of daily life, where absence becomes normal. Where responsibility expands quietly, where loss is absorbed into routine, and where survival is not a single act, but a continuous process. And as we move into the final part of this story, we'll begin to see how all of this work, absence, memory, adaptation eventually forms a new kind of normal, a life that does not return to what it was before, but instead learns how to continue within what remains. So, we've reached that strange final stretch of this story, the part where nothing dramatic happens anymore, because by now, drama has already been absorbed into everyday life. It has already been folded into the rhythm of waking up, working, surviving, and going to sleep again. And what remains is something quieter. Stranger, in a way. A kind of new normal that nobody ever agreed to. But everyone is living inside anyway. Now, let's stay with the village a little longer. Same place. Same fields. Same worn paths between homes and water. But the people moving through it now are different in a subtle, cumulative way. Not because they changed overnight, but because time has been doing what time always does, shaping people through repetition. And for peasant women, that repetition has been intense. Work, loss, adjustment, work again, and again, and again. Now by this stage, something interesting happens. Tasks that once felt overwhelming start to feel familiar. Not easy. Not light, just familiar. You know how long it takes to tend the fields alone. You know how to stretch supplies in ways that make them last just a bit longer. You know which days are hardest, and which ones might offer a small window of breathing room. And that knowledge becomes a kind of structure, not a comforting one exactly. But a stable one. Now let's gently drift into something important, because over time, survival stops being a reaction. It becomes a system, a way of organizing life around what is available rather than what is ideal. You don't plan for perfect conditions. You plan for whatever reality shows up next. And that shift is profound, because it changes how people think about the future, not as something guaranteed, but as something managed. Carefully. Day by day. Now, let's move into the household again, because inside these homes, something else has also settled. Roles have been redistributed so thoroughly that they are no longer questioned. Women are not helping. anymore. They are maintaining, running, holding everything together, not because anyone formally recognized it, but because there is no alternative structure left that functions otherwise. And strangely, over time, that responsibility becomes part of identity, not in a dramatic, empowering speech kind of way, just in the quiet understanding that this is what life requires now. Now, let's drift into memory again, because even though time has moved forward, it hasn't erased what came before. It has simply layered over it. The past doesn't disappear, it blends into routine. A tool used a certain way because someone once showed you. A farming habit passed down and now repeated without thought. A phrase remembered in someone's voice that is no longer present. And all of that sits inside daily life, without interruption. Now let's gently touch something else. Change in community structure. Because war doesn't only affect individuals, it reshapes villages. Some homes remain empty,